Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. My name is Lewis Black. I am the CEO and founder of Almonty Industries. We are primarily focused on tungsten. We are the largest producers outside of China, and this is our latest presentation. What we have right now in our portfolio is considered to be the premier tungsten project in the world, which is the Shandong project in South Korea. This project is the largest both in reserves and in grade outside of China, and it's essentially going to account for approximately 7 to 10% of global supply, meaning essentially 30% of non-Chinese supply. China accounts for about 83% of all production. This mine has a 90+ year mine life, although we expect it to go significantly longer than that. It is in a product in tungsten where we are based in South Korea, where ultimately both the semiconductor and the EV battery market is now voracious consumers of tungsten. Tungsten is used as a tungsten gas to produce a semiconductor, and we'll talk a little bit about that a bit later. And in the anodes and the cathodes in the latest generation of batteries now being produced from South Korea. This mine has a potential to be an extraordinary presence in the market, and ultimately our growth potential is quite extraordinary in country. The financing is secured. We have a $75.1 million US loan with KfW IPEX Bank, which is underwritten by the OEKB, Austrian Export Credit Bank. We've recently announced that all the CPs have now been met, which was, quite an undertaking for a company of our size. But we were successful. We achieved that, and now all CPs are met. We had a successful IPO on the ASX earlier last year, and we have some unique features within our company. One of them being this 15-year offtake agreement that we have at Shandong, which ultimately gives us a hard floor, no cap on the upside. And the guarantee starts at an APT price of 235. And to give you an example, right now, the price has obviously exploded in the last 12 months, given the additional demands from semiconductors and EVs. And we're currently sitting at 342. So obviously that's quite a jump. This is our fourth tungsten mine. We are considered to be the premier operating team outside of China. We have 5 generations of knowledge. Our mine in Paniscura has been running uninterrupted for 126 years. So ultimately, there's not much that you can come up with in tungsten that we don't know about. And one of the benefits of Shandong and working with KfW is that this mine, although it be at a brownfields, had to be completely redesigned to comply with the latest ESG basically conditions and compliance that we are now requested to work under. We have, by complete accident, 100% renewable energy at site, which is from our local nuclear power station. Everything has been designed both above, on surface and underground to the Equator Principles, which is the highest level of ESG compliance that is international standards. And we have extraordinary support, both locally and from the federal government in Korea, which has been evidenced by such things as they have paid and installed a 16th scale pilot plant for us to work, and then given it to the company. They've installed potable water, sewerage lines. They're now in the process of finishing up the 21.6 kilometer power line coming to site. They've repaved the entire town. In their mind, this is an extraordinarily important project for the Korean economy. As I said, the price of tungsten is been rising rapidly. This is already out of date, this slide. We had a further 2 rises since this was done. We are now closer to 50% in the last 12 months. And currently it does not look like abating. Demand is significantly outstripping supply. Our presence is in countries where we consider them to be safe jurisdictions. This is predominantly because our client base requires total transparency on supply chain. And this obviously makes this a much simpler undertaking when you're operating in such countries as Spain, Portugal, South Korea. And also because our engineers like to feel that they're within a 45-minute drive of a decent restaurant. So between those two things, this is ultimately where we have to focus. And we've been very well supported by our customers following this strategy. As a group, the company is all about Samdong. I mean, our other sites are good, they're reliable, but they are, in the scheme of things, relatively small. Although their advantage is they're European-based, and as further diversification occurs within our sector, we have European customers who are very happy that we exist and that they can send a truck to pick up the material rather than have to rely on shipping containers. And that support has been translated into premium prices and ongoing support for our offtakes. Well, tungsten. Well, I think the market change, although tungsten has been used in semiconductors really from the beginning, the marked change came about 18 months ago when Roskilde essentially announced that tungsten had transitioned from industrial metal to a technology metal. It is still used extensively within industry, aerospace, car industry, defense, medical. And ultimately, the car sector is the largest consumer, has been historically 26%. And we've seen a drop in demand because there are problems now with producing vehicles because of the semiconductor shortages. We would then suspect that the price of tungsten would decline, but in fact, we've seen exactly the opposite, because as the car industry's demand has slipped because of the bottlenecks they're facing, we've seen a dramatic increase in the consumption by the semiconductor business and also now the battery business in South Korea. And so we expect that as the semiconductor business settles, the car industry comes fully back online, it is going to be even further bullish for our sector. There just is not enough tungsten produced currently to supply all the demand. To give you an example, Korea is entirely dependent on one supplier, one country to supply its tungsten oxide. 94.7% of all its tungsten comes from one source. And this ultimately, again, is problematic given the problems they had with urea and the problems they had with coal from Indonesia. They're looking to loosen that supply chain. It's been declared a critical raw material, not just by South Korea, but also Canada, the EU, the US, Japan, Australia. It is something which is irreplaceable, and yet there's very few comps to look at, because ultimately China is the dominant factor here. And that has certainly been a huge advantage that we've had, in that we've been able to attract the most blue chip customer base and financing, like for instance from KfW, which ultimately means that that's the great distinction that we've been able to rise to the top. In this slide, we also talk briefly about the tungsten oxide. This is what's predominantly being used in anode and cathode manufacturing. And of course, it's the raw material to produce the tungsten hexafluoride gas, which is used in the production of all semiconductors. And in that tungsten gas production, 40% of that is consumed internally in Korea. Korea has, according to Deloitte, roughly 20,000 companies working in the semiconductor sector. And of course, Samsung, which is the largest producer by revenue of semiconductors in the world. So tungsten and Taiwan are the two main players, but tungsten is again, has increased its consumption of tungsten oxide dramatically in the last 18 months. And we've seen that from the stats of the imports coming in from China. Again, our presence in Korea offers a unique downstream opportunity. Obviously, 45% of our output is put over to our offtake for 15 years with GDP and Plant C, and that underpins the entire company. But the other 55%, even though it was not going to be on my radar in the short term, that has certainly changed. We've now pivoted because ultimately the demand in country now is so great that we have a unique opportunity to be able to meet that demand. So Samdong. Well, I mean, this picture was from, in fact, the 60s, and this was outside of the Incheon airport in South Korea, and of course the sign clearly, stated the largest producer in the free world. This mine was a vast resource in its day. It essentially accounted for 30% of GDP for South Korea, as well as the fact that it also produced or created some of the largest corporations in South Korea. So its legacy there is unmatched. As I said, we started construction last year. So the portals have been complete, road and river diversions have been completed on site, mine underground development continues. We've not, the time that it took us to close the KfW loan to complete the CPs has not hindered us in the slightest. We have been busy and we intend to still commission at the end of this year. Our expectations, everything is still on time. In terms of our long lead time equipment, we managed to shield ourselves from many of the cost escalations that we've seen with all these inflationary pressures, but we are well underway. And this has been done with our equity component that we've already deployed into the project. So the project itself, well, it's in a great location. It's 187 kilometers from Seoul. It's connected almost all the entire way by highway. It essentially takes just under 2.5 hours. A little bit less if you drive like the Spanish, a little bit longer if you drive like a South Korea, but it's in that ballpark. As we said, production is anticipated, commissioning is anticipated in Q4 of this year. We obviously have both a JORC and a 43-101 reserve on this project. After 13 years of proven and probable, of measured and indicated, we didn't go out any further. This resource, the historical data shows us this goes on for 90 plus years. And there comes a point where you have to just say, well, that's enough. As an operator, we only need to operate 4 years ahead of ourselves. But ultimately, this resource is vast and runs at around about 2.5 to 3 times the average grade that you find globally. In terms of extension case, ultimately to increase our output for this 55% has already been in our planning now for some time. With the 45%, we pass through 640,000 tons a year. If we move that to 1.2 million tons, we then are at maximum output in current design phase. Ultimately, if the world keeps pivoting towards tungsten, as we anticipate it will in South Korea, we could ultimately look at working a greater redesign of the project because what we have is something you can't buy in that sense, which is longevity. And our resource is so large that it gives us that opportunity to be able to look at that. So the summary of this project is it's a long mine life. It's a vast resource. It has one of the lowest costs, and it really does have one of the lowest costs, not because we are smart at what we do, although I would always say we are, but because the grade is so much higher than any other project. And grade and longevity forgives a lot of sins, especially in the early days. Of course, we've always been cost competitive with China, even with projects that are, our Los Santos project was a great example. And we have developed over the years many technologies that we use because we've been in this for so long. But if we just break this down to its nuts and bolts, the grade of this project is an enormous win for us. And I think that's very important to remember. In terms of recoveries, well, we work with both flotation and gravity in our other sites. This project will be exclusively flotation. This is because historically it always was, and flotation always has a much more predictable, especially in the early years, outcome in the ramp up because it's a chemical process. And so ultimately we've decided to stay with exactly what worked before. And if it's not broken, why fix it? So it's the largest tungsten mine outside of China. It's fully permitted. Financing agreement is signed and done. It's obviously going to be a significant employer in this region, which ultimately has been starved of economic activity for many years since this mine shut in '92. The potential is 90 plus years of output. The tax payments are really only scratching the surface. There's a whole range of proposals that are being put to us by the government in order to support this project. And as we continue to develop and build it, there'll be further announcements according to that. And I think this element of environmental aspect is very important because ultimately this is the future. Mines have to exist now in the 21st century. It's no longer just, it's no longer the case that you can say, oh, we need the mine, we need the output, therefore we sort of just put it there and everyone has to be quiet. You have to now be compliant for your supply chain transparency to the end users, that you've conformed to the highest international standards of ESG compliance. There's no ifs, no buts, and you have to have spent enough time, which we did. We spent 4.5 years designing this so that it can exist cost effectively as an operator, because there's often a push that you can just agree and do things that are cost prohibitive. But this compliance to the Equator Principles, I think, is one of the defining features of this mine and all new mines. All new mines have to comply with this. Otherwise, they have no tier 1 access to the best customers. Again, the Equator Principles is a well-trodden path. I don't think I have to spend too much time talking about it, but it accounts for every single element that involves this project on surface and underground, and how it incorporates and integrates itself with not just the environment, but also with the community, the social basis of it. So this is a very well extended program. Some mines have ESG programs that apply to certain elements of their mine. Under the KfW conditions of this project finance lend and of our own customer, we've had to apply the ESG to every single facet of this project. Well, this slide, I think, gives a pictorial image of the size of this project. It's vast. We have 10 mining areas in our zone, and this 90+ years applied to 2 of them. We know a third one was drilled by the government back in the 80s and showed again vast resource of tungsten and grade. I think we can safely say that this mine will operate while none of us are still around. It is, I mean, our mine in Panasqueira was unique. It was 126 years and still going. This mine will easily top that. And so I think it's a very unique project, and it was very well preserved by the government when they shut it down in '92, as well as the fact that some of the legacy issues you find with brownfields, like tailings dams and contamination, these elements, this was all addressed by the government back then and are still being addressed now. So we don't have that sort of ongoing liability, which is extremely important in a brownfield, especially when you're operating in an advanced democracy like South Korea, which has very stringent environmental laws and codes. There's tungsten everywhere. I mean, you walk into a portal, within a meter, you run into tungsten. There's good and bad to this. As an operator, you're always looking for barren areas to put adits. You're always looking for barren areas to basically put your access ramps. We don't have barren areas. We just have high grade and higher grade. And so there's been a lot of planning in this, but ultimately this is as a tungsten guy, this is an extraordinary geologically deposit. Absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it's extraordinary. We expect it to be one of the lowest cost producers. We do this on the basis of our own experience. In fact, the numbers we use here are in fact higher than the numbers that Hatch, who is the independent engineer for the KfW, they feel that we've actually been too conservative in our cost estimates. But we, as operators, like to always ensure that we deliver what we promise. But the grade of this project is such that, and obviously the recovery we have from flotation will ensure that this can be extraordinarily cost competitive against any mine that's currently in operation or is anticipated going forward. So we have a very strong future, I believe. The outlook is basically talking here about the project. As we said, we've already begun construction. So ultimately, all of a long lead item equipment will be on site at some time in beginning of March. We had a delay of about a month and a half because of the shipping, but ultimately everything is on target as such. The good news is that because we've started our underground mine development last year, we're about 6 months ahead of schedule. That'll ensure no bottlenecks on ore on surface for the plant. And because we are using flotation, which is a chemical process, we have a much more highly predictable ramp up. With gravity, I love gravity. We in Panasqueira, we work in Portuguese project, we work with gravity. We have the highest recoveries in the world in Portugal for a gravity plant in tungsten, but it took 40 years to balance it. it takes a number of years to balance a gravity plant. Flotation, as I said, is a chemical process, far more predictable. In terms of our peer group, well, I mean, ultimately, we sit at the lower end of the spectrum of our peer group. I think that's really a combination of we haven't been marketing as much as we could have, but that's because we were in fact securing and finalizing the KfW loan. And I'm one of these people that believe that you should really only go out there and announce yourself to the world when you have something to announce. And I think also we've seen some lagging because it has taken a significant amount of time to complete the CPs with the bank, and people think, well, are they really going to do it? Ultimately, I understand that time can sometimes lead to frustration, but as an insider and as one of the largest shareholders and someone who's put more than $7 million of my own money into this, I look at that, the fact that I knew that this was going to get done. It was a slog, but it was worth it because it was essentially very affordable money. And that was going to put us in good stead for the future, especially with a lender like KfW, who is essentially a development bank, not a commercial bank, meaning that they're going to support us in our endeavors as we grow. And that's really important. Something worse than having a lender you're having to look over your shoulder at. I think KfW have walked hand in hand with us on this. And so I suppose as an investor, we offer rather a good opportunity because, as we said, in terms of our peer group, we are the lower end. So I mentioned on this briefly before, this 55%, which I was really only going to consider in a number of years after commissioning, we've had to pivot and we've now brought that forward because ultimately within South Korea, there is now, especially with the government, are now essentially coming to us and saying, look, what can we do to help? Because they've already basically put together $420 billion for the next 8 years to increase semiconductor output. They basically have seen dramatic increases in the amount that they're bringing in from China. They did a study on their dependency on certain commodities. Magnesium ingots was #1 at 100%. Tungsten oxide was #2 at 94.7%. And they want to see how they can reduce that. They want to diversify the ability of not being so dependent because they had, a number of scares last year with urea, which I think in Australia they called AdBlue, where China cut off supply because they didn't have supply to give, which caused, transport chaos within South Korea. They've had issues with coal from Indonesia, which has again also been problematic for them. So I think ultimately, as an operator, when a government comes to you and some of the largest corporations in South Korea come to you and say, look, what can we do to help? You don't say, come back in 3 years or 4 years. So we're now looking at how we can, in fact, embrace this increasing demand in country. And I think that ultimately that 55% and more, if we develop the site further, could have a profound effect on our short-term growth. And so to basically just summarize this downstream opportunity, obviously we have our agreement with Plant C GDP. This is, basically this is what underpins the entire project, absolutely underpins it. That 45% of the output with the hard floor. And in the worst case, if prices collapse, we have, in the worst case, 10 to 12 million in free cash flow. We can cover all our obligations, including all our financing costs, repayments, interest, everything. That's how that hard floor was calculated. But we also now have an opportunity to basically take our project to the 1.2 million ton that it's been designed for in a quicker fashion than we had originally contemplated, and look to put that into the domestic market, bearing in mind that South Korea is the largest consumer of tungsten per capita in the world. And so ultimately, I think we're going to have further announcements to really talk about this going forward as this whole story evolves. And so that is my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that it inspired some of you to see what we're trying to do. It's been a long journey for us as a company, but I've always maintained that low-cost financing for the world's largest tungsten mine was going to be the absolute cornerstone of the success of the project.
Luis, thank you very much for your great presentation. Now we still have about 20 minutes left for Q&As.
Oh, I apologize. I thought I had a 45-minute allocation, so I left sort of 10 minutes for the questions.
As far as I know, the break will start at 12:15, so about 18 minutes left.
Okay. Well, fire away any questions if anyone has any.
All right. Yeah, some question already came in. So the first one is very detailed about the progress. So according to the website, 17.5 of the substructure had already been built by 1309, and on the 27th of October, 25% have been completed, and on the 7th of February, a bit more than 27% have been finalized. So what is the reason for the slower increase over the last month? So at least every week between 1.5 and 2% of the underground construction should be completed in order to keep the schedule until the end of the year. Is this realistic?
Well, firstly, the progress site has slowed, one, because we were completing this loan. So obviously the equity comes to its successful conclusion in its deployment. But also now, what they've turned their attention to is the detailed engineering studies for the construction of the surface buildings. So ultimately, we expected a much harsher winter than we got. Normally, we have a meter of snow, half a meter of snow. This year, we got literally centimeters, nothing. And so we are going to start our foundation work in April. But yes, you're going to see large jumps in those increments. It's not being done in the sense of that 2%. So we don't count the detailed engineering studies as construction. So they're essentially just the planning. So things are slowed while that's done, but the procurement of all of the product, or all the materials that we need for surface are now underway. And we expect in April to start laying the foundations, and then you'll start seeing further jumps, quite extraordinary jumps that'll bring us in line to still be commissioned. Remember, we'll still be doing work at this site next year underground. Underground mine development isn't going to, is over a 2-year program. It's over 2,000 meters of new adits and new access ramps. We are going to start before those are completed. So even when we commission, we won't be at 100%. That's also worth bearing in mind. The program for the mine underground development is ongoing until probably toward the end of next year, and then we'll get into the normal process of approach for our mine planning.
Okay, so it's not a linear progression. There are jumps in it, basically.
And there's jumps, and also ultimately we were closing this loan out. So there's only so much equity we had to deploy. We deployed over 18.2 US million dollars to site. So that's been keeping the lights on and keeping progress going. But the loan we'd hoped to close a month earlier than we did, but now it's done. So ultimately we haven't lost any time.
Then there is a question for, if I understand it correctly, for a financial calendar. So a calendar with upcoming events and financial reports. Can that be found in the future on the website?
Yes. I think our AGM is coming up in June, I believe, and I think our annual results will be out in March, if I'm correct. I know the auditor is busy right now on the group's numbers. Look, we've essentially moved from a production company to a development company. Panasqueira is open, but it's an old mine. At these prices, it makes a small amount of money, but ultimately, and we'll continue to finish all the permits and all the bits we have to do for Valtrachal. But our focus now is Samdong. We are a development company, so we are not looking at producing, blockbuster accounts showing vast earnings per share until this mine opens. So I think it's very important to note that we are now a different company than we were, say, 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And the molybdenum reserves, could they help you get better financing conditions? And so when can we expect to have the new resource estimations being finalized?
Well, the moly is being drilled, but now somewhat slower because we're now pivoting towards what the government is asking us about, this 55%. So the moly will still be, is still in our, it's in our, basically our viewpoint, but I'm not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. If the government is coming to me and the large corporations in Korea are coming to me and saying, listen, what can we do to help for this 55%? I'm not going to say, well, can you just come back to me after I've finished the moly? The moly will be completed during next year. It has slowed down because of this pivot towards this 55%, because there's more work to be done to be able to get programs firmly in place from the government. But I haven't forgotten about the moly. I just don't want to confuse the story internally, domestically, by talking about moly with the government.
Okay. And when would you like to have the first installment of the KfW loan paid out?
What, you mean the drawdown?
I think so, yes.
Well, the drawdown should be in about about a fortnight, I think, if I know the numbers correctly. So in about 2 weeks, the first drawdown. And the good news is that there's no repayment. There's a grace period, ultimately, for the next, next 2+ years. It's when we get to what they call project completion, which is when we've hit all of our bogeys for 9 months consistently. So we have an extended grace period, which is extremely good for the project.
Okay. And the next question from the chat, do you have an updated schedule for the mine to open? And do you see any obstacles in the way?
Well, I assume you're talking about the mine in Samdong. Well, we are still looking at the end of this year. I suppose my biggest fears are what's going on with inflation. And so we're having to manage this very carefully. A lot of the building materials that we have yet to order, it worries me about how much of an escalation we're going to look there. I'm already sort of juggling things where I'm actually going to be using some of my workshops in Panascara to produce some of the equipment that we need so we can shield ourselves from those costs. This equipment, basically, we're not building computers here, but we are trying to be as flexible as we can. But I suppose my biggest concern is keeping this within budget. And I believe at the moment we have a good handle on that, but this increasing, accelerating inflation is it does worry me. But we're operators. We've seen good times and bad times. We're pretty nimble when it comes to finding solutions.
And the next question is, what will be the next data points that we can anticipate for the remainder of 2022, providing confirmation that Almonty's case is on track as we have presented, if you have presented it? Okay,
so basically, drawdown will be the next announcement. Then there'll be announcements regarding downstream, or we may do downstream before drawdown. It depends on the timing of certain data that we're waiting to receive. Then ultimately, we intend to have basically twice a month updates to our website and also on the press releases regarding what's going on at site. We will also be running essentially a similar system showing percentage of completions and what bogeys we have to hit. And I think what we're going to ultimately do is put together a program on our website where you can actually track it and see if we're hitting our benchmarks. And then, of course, we'll encourage people to, not too many, but if we are falling behind in one area, to write to me and ask, what the hell is going on? Because you should know. I mean, look, I'm one of the largest shareholders and I put a lot of my own money in this, but ultimately, I think that you need to have access. And I think shareholders that I know, and I know a lot of the shareholders, they do have access to me. Sometimes it can take me a few days to come back to you because there's quite a lot of things going on, but I think it's important that if someone has an investment in Almonty and they see, I don't know, the steel bar or one area of construction is lagging behind others, they should have the right to say, hey, what's going on? Is there a problem? Yeah. So transparency is very important. And that's really now been our watchword, especially, the supply chain transparency, ESG, we have to be transparent in all areas. No surprises.
Yeah, I think that's a good choice to be transparent. So yeah. The next question, I'm not sure if I understand it correctly. I just read it to you word by word. People and work, current situation, direct or indirect. Can you make sense of that?
People work.
People and work, I mean, probably how many are employed and what's the current situation, and are there direct or indirect contracts? That's what I guessing is the person asking the question is.
Okay. I mean, right now we have a team of around 20 people at Almonty Korea Tungsten Corporation. Then there's a further 64 people who are with the mining contractor and civil contractors at sites. This will ultimately increase overall to around 200 during the build, 180, 200. What we're seeing is the normal kind of metric to use is for every direct job in a mine, there's 6 indirect jobs. So we're seeing that our civil contractor especially is taking at least 20% of its workforce from the local town, which is Samdong. But employment will continue to increase as this project is further developed. And I think we'll hit when the major construction goes on at surface, which is the plant and the grinding areas, you'll see almost 200 people at site.
All right. And another question from the same person. When is the IPO in Korea planned?
Well, I mean, ultimately, I think it's important to get this project operational and working. And I think at that point, we would look very seriously at this IPO in Korea, because there's a good brand recognition of Korea Tungsten. You'll be working with some of the largest corporations within Korea. You'll have government support from federal all the way down through region, through county. You'll have a very good support structure, but there are very strict rules regarding the listing in Korea. One of them is that, you know, they don't like exploration companies. They don't have a mining sector. They have enormous multiples for industrial companies. And I think once you're downstreaming, you would then qualify as an industrial company. I would like to feel that our future is in South Korea. It's where our growth center is going to be. I think it's a natural progression to list there, but I think we have to list there at the right time when we can get the most bang for our buck. But ultimately, we'll be within 24 months, we'll be operating, and everything goes according to plan, we'll be working well. So 24 months, an enormous amount of time, not especially when you're looking, it's going to take at least 9 months to prepare an IPO. But I think in answer to your question, it's certainly something which is very much on our radar. Unless, of course, these recent developments in Korea regarding the downstream is that they want us to do an IPO immediately for, you know, to get maximum exposure. We'll see. But I'm always open to it, and I will be very supportive of it when it happens.
Right. Yeah, these were all the questions. Okay,
well, we've got 4 minutes. So, you know, I mean, it seems a shame to waste them, but I have no idea what else you want me to say if there's no more questions. And maybe, you know, Mario, do you have anything to say? You've always got something to say. Do you have a question, Mario?
Mario, you're on mute.
Sorry. So what I like about Almonty is that you provide to the industry world outside China a commodity that is very important. And a friend of mine who works in the production space, he's also working with China, and he says there's only supply issues, generally speaking, outside China. So in China, there's no supply chain issue. So they're smart. And so for that reason, when the world outside China needs tungsten, then Almonty could be or will be most likely the first choice in the future. So for that reason, I think that Almonty has a great few years ahead, and the investors and Louis will make a lot of money, I think. So it's just a mess.
No, Mario, I don't disagree. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons we've been so well supported by our sector, because, you know, come rain or shine, we deliver to spec. Sometimes it's not easy, but we get the job done. And we have, as I said, 5 generations of knowledge of how to do this. And we also happen now to have the world's best tungsten mine under our belt. And it wasn't easy to get. I mean, let's not forget that this was not an easy project to acquire. It took 9 months of persuasion and creative thinking, but it's considered by our entire industry, including out of China, the significance of this mine. And I would imagine we're not going to make an enormous amount of new friends in China because of this mine, because this mine really is extraordinary. But I think that we have a team that is not going to rely on consultants to build it. We're very comfortable with how we operate and how we've always operated. And I think yes, I think you're right. I think our shareholders, including myself, are going to make a great deal of money from this, and I think they deserve it, because ultimately we've really got something very special.
And 2 more questions just came in, so that's good. So why do you think the shares are mainly traded in Germany?
I think because ultimately, between Plancy Group, who's our off-taker, it's obviously a very significant presence in Austria, and KfW IPEX, and we do trade a bit in Australia as well. Let's be fair. I mean, it's not a bad liquidity in Australia, but I think Germany is far more up to speed as to the importance of what we're doing. In Canada, look, I mean, it's a listing that we've had for many years. The resource market in Canada has not had a good time. And I think that they've certainly pivoted in Canada towards other sectors. I think in Germany, they get it. I think our German investors have really understood the importance of what we have and the importance of tungsten to this global economy, especially in these new technology metals and new technology sectors like EVs, the batteries, and like semiconductors. So I think that's why. And I think they know that KfW doesn't say yes to everybody. It's a long, hard slog to get them on board, because, as they always remind me, they have a 100% track record of no bankruptcies and no defaults, which means that, you know, they don't want a project that is going to blow up. And so they were very, very stringent in their analysis of us. And I think German investors, they know how tough KfW are. You know, they're not handing out checks willingly over there. You've got to pry it loose, and you've got to really be able to demonstrate that they're not going to blemish their record with you.
All right. So one last question. When do you expect to sign agreements with Korean semiconductor customers such as Samsung?
Well, I mean, I think that discussion is ongoing, but I think that whether it's with the government or whether it's with the trader that manages the distribution to the large semiconductor manufacturers, will all occur during this year. That would be that would certainly be my prediction. I think they want to get this sewn down. We have an election in Korea on March 9th, presidential election. I think that regardless, the bureaucratic system in Korea has been looking at this. I think the announcements will come sooner rather than later in 2022 on this.
All right. That were all the questions.
There we go. 18 minutes, Matthias. There we go. We got there. No problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect timing again.
Okay. Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Louis.
Thanks, Matthias. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mario. Take care, guys.